Hey guys, Hashi here. Today I'd like to talk about a fairly controversial topic within some parts of the Warhammer community, and that is the ruinous powers of chaos and their place as the grand connector of the Warhammer mythos. Now to some of you this may come as a shock, but yes, chaos is the same and it links Warhammer Fantasy, Warhammer Age of Sigmar, and even Warhammer 40,000 all together. Now the first question you may be asking is, wait, didn't GW say that's not true? And the answer is no, there really isn't any statement, it's totally made up. I have even gone so far as to try to find the origin of the claim, like looking at message boards and fan sites from the late 90s and early 2000s. Needless to say, no citation or evidence was ever found. All I ever found were people coping about statements referring to Warhammer's multiverse or misconstruing quotes about the squats. This video will be structured a bit differently due to a vital part of the erroneous claim that chaos has been retconned, being that it requires that chaos to have been changed at some point in time. Or in other words, for chaos to no longer be the same. As you will find out in this video, there is no point where chaos has been changed in the way people need it to be. So if you somehow have this statement that chaos has been changed, I'd love to see it. But because I don't really believe in retcons, I mean in the sense that I don't think one scan or one statement overrides dozens over the period of years, what I really believe is that there could be like new evidence that helps form a new, more consistent interpretation. So even if we do have this one-off statement, due to the sheer amount of evidence that keeps coming out, it would remain that the most consistent interpretation is that chaos is the same between the settings. It's basically the same game people play with chaos only being galaxy level or whatever. I mean sure, you can play the whole we know they're wrong game for a few statements, but after you get dozens and dozens, you can't say that anymore. What you need is an actual positive quote that says they are only galaxy level, or chaos isn't the same. Before we get into this, I'd like to ask you to share this video. I'm genuinely tired of hearing people pretend that chaos isn't the same despite all the evidence that has popped up over the years, and I'd like this video to be another vaccine for another problem in the community. To start, we have the era of 1983 through to 86. This is the pre-40k, pre-Realm of Chaos era. At this point, chaos was largely unexplored, only being delegated to models labeled chaos, such as in the 2nd edition Fantasy Bestiary. We would see chaos warriors with the rules for them referring to the upcoming Realm of Chaos book. We do know that chaos was actively being worked on at this time, not just something that's planned. For example, in White Dwarf 107 from 1988, we are told that the Realm of Chaos books were in production for 5 years, so this would start in 1983. We do have a PDF for the Chaos source book, but this is dated to a few years later. And by the way, in the source book, they don't make a distinction either. Big ups to the Awesome Lies blog for getting its hands on this. In 1987, we have White Dwarf 93, which states that the at the time new game of Warhammer 40,000 Rogue Trader shares a background with Warhammer Fantasy. 1987 also marks the release of said Warhammer 40,000 Rogue Trader in the 3rd edition of Warhammer Fantasy, which is the edition where Chaos gets its first release, an establishing background book in the form of Realm of Chaos Slaves to Darkness, which would come out in the following year of 1988. In this book, Games Workshop provided players with their first real taste of chaos, giving us rules and background for the ruinous powers for Warhammer 40,000 Rogue Trader, Warhammer Fantasy, and Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay. In this book, it outright states that chaos is shared between the settings, and thus by the conception of the chaos gods being the same is even present in the first place. In 1990, we got the second installment of Realm of Chaos, that being The Lost and the Damned, in which yet again the Warhammer mythos, as White Dwarf 93 had called it 3 years prior, shares chaos. In modern times, the two Realm of Chaos books are treated as one thing, and they kinda are for most intents and purposes, as they have the two gods in each book that combine to explain chaos in its entirety. We wouldn't see much in the way of chaos releases until 1996, where we got Warhammer Fantasy's 5th edition and White Dwarf 199. In this White Dwarf article, Andy Chambers explains that the goal of the 2nd edition Chaos Codex was to summarize the Realm of Chaos books into one book. Not only this, but in Codex Chaos proper, we have the designer notes, where the contents of the White Dwarf article would be repeated, saying that the original Realm of Chaos books were summarized and what changes were actually made. Mind you, none of them involve disregarding the connection between the settings, and the only thing that's even referred to as being dated is the unit selection, not the lore or narrative. The icing on the cake is in White Dwarf 202, where we are told that when making a Chaos army you can use miniatures from Fantasy or 40k because they are interchangeable. In the following year of 1997, we would see that in White Dwarf 207 there would be an article talking about the at the time new greater demon of Nurgle, the Great Unclean One. In this article, we would get the statement, quote, "Across the rotten bridge of damnation, the greater demon of Nurgle emerges into the worlds of both Warhammer and Warhammer 40,000. This quote clearly spells out that demons as one group can go into both settings, which is the opposite that you would expect if the settings had different chaos gods. Also in 1997, we would see Realm of Chaos 5th edition for Warhammer Fantasy, in which during the designer commentary we are told that Chaos as the grand enemy of the Warhammer mythos had its standards set by the original Realm of Chaos books. The phrase Warhammer mythos is also used in a previously mentioned White Dwarf 93 to refer to both settings. In 1998, we would see White Dwarf 217, and in an article talking about the new Chaos models, Paul Sawyer would cite the original 2 Chaos source books along with Codex Chaos as extremely high standard and setting the tradition of excellence for Chaos. He even goes on to call the Realm of Chaos the sister book to Codex Chaos. Later on in the year, Warhammer 40,000's 3rd edition would be released. Following in the year 1999, we would see White Dwarf 230, where when talking about the Keeper of Secrets model, it is stated that it can hear anything that is said in any dimension. Which on its own sounds like it could mean anything, but then the article goes on to show the Keeper of Secrets in both games, implying that the quote applies to them both. It should be noted as well that at the bottom of the page, the 4 greater demons are displayed with the descriptions that don't even attempt to differentiate the settings. Also in 1999, we would get Inferno Volume 16, where the story called The Ultimate Ritual is published. In this story, we would see 2 fantasy characters get taken through the Realm of Chaos, and then they would see elves in bubble-domed cities, clearly referring to the Eldari of Warhammer 40,000. In 2000, we would see Warhammer Fantasy 6th edition, and a few years later in 2002, White Dwarf 270 and 274 would come out. In the former, we are given a lot of details about the origin of Chaos from an out-of-universe perspective, and how Chaos Army books have evolved since the first 2 Realm of Chaos books. Nowhere in the article is it said that Chaos was fundamentally changed, or that they separated Chaos between the games. And the only thing you could even call a retcon is that they mentioned that they inserted Archaon into the lore. Later on in White Dwarf 274, we would see that at the time the new Lord of Change could be used in Fantasy and 40k, and that when designing the Chaos Codex, the only reason they didn't duplicate the rules for demons in Fantasy is due to the proliferation of ranged weapons in 40k, which further implies that they share the same demons. To make it even worse for the people who think that Chaos has been retconned in White Dwarf 284, Gav Thorpe, Take a Shot, would say that he had to represent the background from the original Realm of Chaos books, due to the Beasts of Chaos not changing as much, so the lore would hold true. In 2004, we would have the release of Warhammer 40,000's 4th edition in Liber Chaotica. Liber Chaotica is important because it makes no distinction between the chaos that is in the old world and the chaos that we see in the grim darkness of the 41st millennium. It is pretty clear cut if you ask me. 2 years later, in 2006, Warhammer Fantasy would see its 7th edition, and Liber Chaotica, the complete edition, would be released without any disclaimers, and with the addition of a section about Chaos Undivided. So not only is Liber Chaotica still being published at this point as a background book, but it is being expanded upon with another volume. Another 2 years would pass to 2008, where we would see White Dwarf 340, where in the Standard Bearer article talking about next month's Chaos release, Jervis Johnson would talk about how Chaos was cemented into the mythos with Realm of Chaos, this masterpiece of fiction. And then the article would go on to say that these releases were made to expand upon the mythic background of Chaos, set up in Realms of Chaos, saying that Chaos is 1 pantheon, not 4 in regards to the gods. Now surely if Chaos was separate at this point, he would have said 2 pantheons for the respective games, right? You know, we've been going on for a little bit in this video, so here, take a minute, pause the video, and type up your response to the video so far. You know, all these are old lore, you know, it's gonna get retconned soon. Just type that up for me for a bit, you know, talk about how, like, none of these quotes are, like, evidence. Go ahead, alright? Okay, you done? Alright, we're gonna keep going now. In the next issue, that being White Dwarf 341, we would see an article talking about the simultaneous release of Chaos Demon rulebooks for Warhammer Fantasy and Warhammer 40,000. When talking about this, the White Dwarf says things like Skulltaker is the same being no matter what planet or what battlefield he strides across. This White Dwarf would also have descriptions for the 4 Chaos Gods, making no distinction for what setting they're for. And the White Dwarf even has the group intellectual property manager at the time, Alan Merritt, saying things in regards to the original Realm of Chaos books, like the exact reason why the Pantheon of Chaos appeared in Warhammer 40,000 as well as Warhammer Fantasy are lost to the mist of time. It just seems like the right thing to do, and to be honest, we've never looked back on it. To top off such an event for Chaos, within the rulebooks we would see the introduction of named demons such as Karanak, Scarbrand, and Kairos Fateweaver, characters who to this day still appear in Chaos stories and rulebooks and are established in books that are meant to represent the same Chaos. Later on this year, we would also see the release of Warhammer 40,000's 5th edition, with the aforementioned Demons Codex being the one for 4th edition. For those who typed out a comment, sorry I set you up like that, but if you saw the rest of the runtime of the video and you thought there wasn't going to be anything else, I don't know what to tell you. Then, in 2010, Warhammer Fantasy would see its 8th and final edition, thankfully. While in 2012, Warhammer 40,000 would see its 6th edition. In 2012, we would also get White Dwarf 392. In this White Dwarf, we would see statements about demons being able to be fielded across both games, and descriptions of said demons that make no distinction about what setting it's referring to. Like, there's a page where the 4 Chaos Gods are described, and there's no indication what game it's for. The header at the top of the page just says Chaos Demons. So for the people who still think they're not the same Chaos, what game does this refer to? You tell me. In the same White Dwarf, demons are stated to have a common heritage, thus why they appear in both games, implying they are spawned from the same Chaos. In October 2012, we would also see the release of Book 1 Betrayal, the first book of Forge World's Horus Heresy game. In the afterword for this book, we would see the Realm of Chaos being called a groundbreaking expansion and background book. I bring this up to show that GW has always been proud of Realm of Chaos, and at no point have they ever been like, yeah, it was so wonky having Chaos be the same, we should probably change that. Like, they've never been like that ever. They've always liked Realm of Chaos. During the 2013 Christmas Advent calendar, Black Library would release Kaldor Drago, Knight of Titan, written by Laurie Golding, the at the time editor for Black Library. In this novel, we would get the quote, "Time flows strangely within the Ephirian. In the scattering of the demon's remains, I see patterns, I see shapes and colors, I see echoes of things that are and futures that were. I see an old world beyond the horizon. A world that likely never was, where sorcery blew in the very winds, and a self-made god-king was all that stood against the ruinous powers. Mayhap I would find the answer there, if I could find it at all. Sheathing the Titan sword, with my tattered cloak whipping around me, I trudge away into the storm. If my destiny will not follow, then I will go on as I always have, alone." This self-made God King is obviously referring to Sigmar, and the Winds of Magic as well, the Winds of Magic. And while some people write this off as just a nod to fantasy, given the amount of evidence we have beside this, it should be a piece of supporting evidence. There's also this bit in the End Times Kane with a knight who wears silver armor, and while it could totally be Kaldor Drago, I think if I said it was, people would point out that his fate of being left on a spear, even though in the book it says that demons cannot kill him and he will eventually take his revenge. In 2014, we would see Warhammer 40,000's 7th edition, and a year later in 2015, Games Workshop would release the first edition of Warhammer Age of Sigmar, where at first Slaanesh would be stated to be missing, and then we would eventually learn that Slaanesh was sealed. Now the regressives will try to latch onto this saying, well, how come Slaanesh isn't sealed in Warhammer 40,000? Well, the answer is simple: time doesn't apply to the warp, as you would know if you read just about any of the Chaos rulebooks or have watched my Deep Warp video. To add on to this, in White Dwarf Weekly 75, it would be stated that Sigmar was flung beyond time after the world that was exploded, so even if we could somehow draw a line of time through the warp at the end of Warhammer Fantasy, it would quickly get invalidated by the start of the Age of Sigmar. 2016, we would see the recompilation of the first 2 Realm of Chaos books into the form of Index Chaotica Apocrypha. In this collection of articles and publications, Games Workshop would reprint the same pages that say that demons are the same across both games, with the only addition being supplemental text at the bottom saying this is where they established the difference between summoned demons and possessed demons. But even if we exclude the reprinted pages, at the beginning of the book we are given a new introduction that says, "Since the release of the first books dedicated to the threat of chaos in the worlds of Warhammer, the awful horror of the Chaos Gods and their followers have reinforced the grim darkness of the Warhammer 40,000 setting." And then it would also say, quote, "This collection of extracts, artworks, sketches, and stories reveals the true nature of chaos in the 41st millennium as you may have never seen it." So not only are they saying that chaos is shared between the worlds of Warhammer, but also that the true nature of chaos is that it's linked. In the December issue of White Dwarf, it would go on to call the book, quote, "stuffed with the finest chaotic content across 30 years of publication," end quote. In 2017 and 2018 respectively, we would see Warhammer 40,000's 8th edition and Age of Sigmar's 2nd edition. In the January 2018 issue of White Dwarf, it would say that, quote, "The realm of chaos reaches all throughout space and time, existing in an infinite number of realities. As such, Nurgle's servants are as likely to appear in the 41st millennium as they are to appear in the mortal realms." Later on in the year, in the June issue of White Dwarf, in the Ask the White Dwarf column, when asked about Slaanesh being born of the Eldari in 40k, the White Dwarf would respond, "The realm of chaos spans all of existence." He then goes on to say that through the realm of chaos or warp, Slaanesh can do stuff in any of the settings. The next year, 2019, Liber Chaotica would be re-released with no disclaimer pages or anything to say it's not canon. So Liber Chaotica, the book that makes no distinction between the settings, is reprinted. This isn't all we would get in 2019, as we would also see the box set titled The Realm of Chaos, Wrath, and Rapture, which came with a lore booklet for Chaos, which, as you could guess, makes no distinction between the settings, and 2 rule booklets, one for each setting. And these rule books do not have any lore in them that would imply that the demons in either setting are different. With the start of the new decade in 2020, Warhammer 40,000 would see its 9th edition in a series of White Dwarfs, starting in White Dwarf 451, the Fantastical Realms series, which talked about the mortal realms individually, turned into Realms of Chaos, with both AOS and 40k listed at the top of the page. Besides the top of the page, the article in issue 451, which talks about Nurgle, mentions that the Garden of Nurgle exists both in the warp and on the edge of reality in the mortal realms, clearly showing that the settings are still connected. The next article would be in issue 453, talking about Khorne, in which the article would say a similar thing about the Blood God's realm existing both in the warp and the edge of reality in the mortal realms, which makes it the same as what was said about Nurgle's garden. Following the Khorne article, we would see in White Dwarf 455 an article about the Great Manipulator Tzeentch, which went on to say that Tzeentch's influence on the armies of the 41st millennium is just as pronounced as those in the mortal realms. In the following year, 2021, Age of Sigmar would see its 3rd edition, and we would see the conclusion of the Realms of Chaos series with Slaanesh in White Dwarf 461. In this article, when talking about paint schemes for your Slaanesh-aligned models, we would see some nice paint jobs for Marines, followed by some Demonettes, where it is said that, quote, Demonettes come in all shades and hues. Sometimes they're influenced by the realm or planet they're fighting in or on. Sometimes they pick colors to please their patron. These Demonettes are painted to reflect the colors of the realm of life, beast, death, and fire. Following this, we would see a few Age of Sigmar models, clearly symbolizing the demons as the link between the 2 settings, something that has been clear since Rogue Trader, despite what some people have claimed. In 2023, we would see the End in the Death Volume 1, where the demon Quethel is mentioned amongst Horus's demonic forces. If we check Tome of Salvation, we find out it is another name for the Great Horned Rat. Later on in 2023, in White Dwarf 487, we would get yet another direct confirmation that Slaanesh is Slaanesh, independent of game system. Then, most recently, in White Dwarf 512, we would get a gallery of Nurgle models for his followers, spanning Age of Sigmar and Warhammer 40,000, with the introduction of the issue making no distinction between the settings, establishing them both as Nurgle. In conclusion, Chaos is a very fundamental part of the Warhammer mythos, and has remained the same linked entity it has been since Realm of Chaos. This sentiment isn't just the conclusion I am drawing based on the mountains of evidence I presented earlier. It is clearly evident in the source material that Chaos is and always has been linked between the settings. It should also be apparent by the lack of evidence that Chaos has ever been retconned or whatever cope is presented next week. This video could have been longer too, like there was a ton of ads in White Dwarf I could have included, or campaign, whatever the fantasy version of Relics is. Either way, there are chainswords and power fists in fantasy, and apparently in Total War from what I've heard. I could have also laid down the law with all the multiversal statements we have in early 40k and fantasy that clearly could only refer to the other game. Anyways, I hope you all enjoyed this video, and I hope to see you all in the next one.